Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Annabelle, Talent Cuter Corner at BioBuzz. I'm thrilled to be here with our amazing guest today, Stephanie Brandford. Stephanie is the founder and validation consultant at Brayearst LLC, specializing in validation, compliance, and process optimization for the life science industry. Stephanie has a degree in chemical engineering from Carnegie Mellon University, and she started her career in the chemical sector before transitioning into medical devices and pharmaceuticals. Stephanie is a Six Sigma black belt and has extensive experience leading validation engineering teams, developing robust compliance strategies, and optimizing processes to meet FDA and global regulatory requirements. So today, during this session, Stephanie is going to be focusing on validation, compliance, and process optimization in regulated industries. But before we dive in, I do want to give a big thank you and mention our sponsor, Biotech, for supporting this program here today. Biotech is a great resource for upskilling in the life sciences. They've trained over 17,000 scientists through hands-on biotech workshops. You can learn more about them at biotrack.com. I also want to mention that this event is part of the BioBuzz Talent Lab, which is your go-to resource for career growth, job opportunities, and industry connections. So if you haven't joined already, I would highly recommend you join our Talent Lab platform. That's the best way to stay connected and access more opportunities like this. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to hand it over to our guest, Stephanie.
Okay, thank you, Annabelle, for that pleasant introduction. Looking forward to sharing some information today. So let's see if we can get this started. All right, so as usual, technical goobers want to jump in at first. All right, so as Annabelle mentioned, I did start my career with chemical engineering. So just to kind of take you through that, because that's going to be a piece of my talk, is talking about how that ties into what I ended up doing. So getting my degree as a chemical engineer, I actually had a decision to make where there were 3 minors I could choose from. I could do computer-aided design, I could do polymers, and I could do biotech. So ironically, I chose computer-aided design, and I ended up doing process simulations for 1 year. Then I went to a polymer manufacturing plant, and I worked there for 8 years. And then I went to medical devices and ended up working in that industry for 23 years. So any of you who are very early and you're making these early choices, I am here to say, don't fret. You might make a decision and end up working in it for 1 out of your 31 years like I did. So relax. So early career, did the chemical industry, and then moved into medical devices. And it was there that I was first approached with validation and had no idea what they were talking about, and soon discovered that, oh, look at that. That fits in with what I was doing, just, from a different perspective. And so I was able to move into that role. And when I moved to another employer, they introduced another new term to me, Six Sigma. I was like, oh, well, what's that? And learned about that. And these 2 things suddenly became, a basis for a career that spanned another couple of decades. So you never know. And then another transition has happened over the past couple of years. You spend 3 decades as an employee, and then you're like, hey, look at this. A new transition is afoot. And what I'm learning now is being within one structure sets you up with a lot of technical knowledge, but now I'm learning a lot of organizational knowledge and learning about how to migrate this technical knowledge into a new structure that I can then share with other organizations. And that's a whole new vector of growth. And so I want to, again, encourage those of you who are early in your careers or even maybe later on, but looking at how you might shift. There's all kinds of opportunities for you to explore different ways to leverage your talents. Now, let me focus back in specifically for those of you who are early on, because again, let me touch on the fact that I didn't exactly plan everything out, despite the fact that it might sound like it was a lovely 1-by-1 step going along. So when I was back at the chemical manufacturing plant, the compliance concerns that we faced there was that the Environmental Protection Agency was worried about whether the chemicals we were manufacturing with were going to get into the environment and, expose our neighbors. Quite literally, we were in a neighborhood, our neighbors to these chemicals. So we actually had to compile data on, what we were manufacturing, how often, and the quantities, and then make calculations on what the emissions likely were to the air and to the water, and submit, documented reports to the EPA reporting what our likely, emissions were. And they had to be under certain limits to say, we were within the permits for the facility. So that type of compiling data and submitting reports was for the EPA, for the chemical industry. Well, lo and behold, when I was introduced to validation years later for a new industry, the fact that I was used to compiling data and submitting reports for government review, those skills were transferable, because now it was compiling data, compiling reports that would be reviewed by the FDA. It's just that data was about whether a manufacturing process would work the way that we claimed. It had a defect rate that was acceptable, or it was cleaned effectively. Same principle, collecting data in a way that you could present to a government body. It was just totally different industry, different government body, but still the same thought process. So I wanted to make sure I include, examples like that for those of you who are early on in your careers, that, as you're doing this work, to, kind of think about perhaps there are ways that what you're doing could be reframed in a new context, so that when an opportunity comes along, you could recognize that, hey, okay, I did that in one context this way, but that same interpretation, could fit in another context. And I actually have another example that came from my polymer manufacturing and my quality role that I had there. So when we had our adhesive manufacturing, you had different viscosities that you kept track of using statistical process control. So you were making sure that you didn't jump around too much, that you had a steady transition from grade to grade of viscosity. But that calculation of means to make sure you had, consistent batches in a certain range, and then standard deviation to make sure you didn't jump too much when you went from range to range. Well, that statistics then carried forward to validation, where mean and standard deviation are part of calculating statistical capability for a batch when you're doing a performance qualification during a validation. So again, I was familiar with the statistics when I was doing statistical process control in a chemical plant, and they carried forward to doing a performance qualification within a medical device plant. So again, those skills transferred into a different industry. And I would encourage for you, if you're early in your career, be ready to recognize that you might have that type of linkage that you can make from an earlier experience into a later experience, and something that you can carry forward that way. Next up, I just want to talk about kind of from my leadership position within validation, what I look for specifically in the roles when I was building a team, and some of the dynamics that are relevant to the validation role. When we were doing validations on projects, because we were typically, doing a limited number of runs, there could be this perception that we were, concerned about just a limited number of runs. But the reason why we would use statistics is the idea that we're doing a prediction of how that process will perform in the long term going forward. So we're actually making a prediction on how reliable that process is going forward. So the idea is we're making a prediction that the process is going to keep making good product going forward. or that your cleaning is going to continue being effective in removing residue going forward, or that your software is going to continue being functional as you're using it day after day going forward, and that your test method will continue to release good samples and fail bad samples going forward, and your contamination control, that day after day, if you continue putting your controls in place, that you'll keep contamination from your people or from your environment from getting into your product. So, whenever you're coming into a team that's responsible for validation, just know that they aren't just concerned about their runs, but that their runs have an implication for going forward. And what does it mean going forward? Because they're supposed to be providing evidence of what's going to happen, after their runs are complete. And then there are stakeholders that are dependent on that evidence, meaning evidence for what's going to happen in the future. And the way I see it, I came up with a simple acronym to try and quickly communicate the 4 stakeholders as I see for the validation role. So OPQR. So operations, they're responsible for, running this equipment, getting the product out the door. They're ultimately wanting to keep this product going out to the market. And so, they're dependent on that when the process has gotten through validation, that it will be reliable to keep going. And then you've got what I've grouped under projects. And so it can be an engineering role or a project management role, even a process engineering role, but whoever is going to help keep the equipment kind of up and running, even a maintenance role, whoever is responsible to keep that up and running, they could come back to the validation data and see if there was a baseline performance, if anything happens to go off kilter in the future. There's kind of a give and take there where they get it running condition, and then validation says, okay, yep, we've got the baseline. And then if they want to make a change or if something goes off, there's a give and take there with those roles. And then you've got quality that's responsible for that day-to-day, making sure the product is good as it goes out the door day after day, batch after batch. Responsible for, if there's any feedback from the customers regarding that. And so they're reliant that, that process validation is made sure there's going to be an acceptable defect rate as that product goes out the door. And then, of course, you've got regulatory, and they're accountable to if there's any government response to, product that's gone out into the market. If there's been any market action that's been necessary, there's going to be some accountability from the government as well if there's something that's, a regulated claim for that product. So those 4, functionals, as I see it, have a relationship independency on validation. And because of that, there's also kind of this dynamic where people will go back and forth between those stakeholder roles and the role of validation, and the responsibilities can go back and forth between there being possibly a separate group or a responsibility within those stakeholder groups. So as I've talked to people at different businesses, sometimes there's a separate validation team, and sometimes validation is owned by one of the stakeholder groups. So when I had a separate team, I had people, come to my team from one of the stakeholder groups, and I've had people from my team go to one of the stakeholder groups. So if you're early in your career, you might go to one of the stakeholders, you might come to validation, you might go back to a stakeholder, you might find out that validation follows you to one of the stakeholder groups. And I've seen that happen as well. So you never know. You don't have to think of, you might go to just this one job title. Responsibilities can kind of flow depending on, how the company wants to organize itself. And so next up, let's talk consulting a little bit. I'll touch on that. So what I had for most of my career, of course, I was with large companies. And so the way validation was structured was, very much under a corporate umbrella. And so what I'm able to do now with having a consulting company is move or go back to the underlying guidance documents as they've come from the professional organizations that I'm a part of, and as they come from the FDA itself, and really look at how the guidance was formed and come up with, I'll say, some of my own interpretations of, how I see things as how they could be a bit more optimal when I look at how the industries operate. In particular, because I was supporting a chemical manufacturing process that was itself regulated as a medical device, but because our product was sold into pharmaceutical and biologics customers, they would audit, and we would have conversations about their expectations as pharma and biologics. And so they had validation expectations from their regs, and then I knew what medical device regs were. And so I had to understand what they were talking about, and I knew what I was talking about. And what I discovered was a lot of the expectations kind of would be useful in each other's industries. And so that's actually something that I look forward to exploring more as I develop more content under Brayearst. And that's certainly, not something I would have done as a corporate employee, because you're more, strictly within the particular banner of one company. But that's the sort of thing that, as you advance in your career, if you find exploration of that sort, being able to go deeper into topics and be able to explore with different companies, that's something that would be more available to you as a consultant versus, being an employee with an individual company. And so the nuts and bolts part of being a consultant is, of course, you have to build the structure, and it's not something that you do all by yourself. I've listed a lot of the organizations I've worked with to build Brayearst to where it is now, and they will definitely be helping me going into the future. So just from the legal structure and all that good stuff, I've had SCORE and SPDC, and believe it or not, my local library. Like literally, I've got a hotspot on loan from the library that when I go to networking events, if you see me on my tablet, my Wi-Fi is courtesy of my local library having a hotspot available. So that's definitely something I recommend. If you haven't been to your library for a while, I'm a big fan of it. And then the professional organizations, that's where I can interact with people, make connections, and, learn more about all the different companies. So you'll see I also categorize them by my 4 stakeholder organizations, just because that's how I like to keep touch with my OPQRs. Then, of course, I've got BioBuzz in there because they're my general partner in a whole lot of things. And then I've got my local chamber in there because they just help me kind of get my businesswoman identity up and running, because I was so used to being an employee. So they helped me get my my new identity going. And I definitely am looking forward to keeping this ride going. It's been a fascinating learning to learn how to be an entrepreneur after having been an employee for 3 decades. So hopefully I have given you guys some stuff to chew on with the various phases of my career. Again, starting off where I was, a solo practitioner, starting off chemical industry, not even realizing I was building skills that would take me forward into a validation career. Who knew? And then as I moved into the validation career, bringing forward that compliance stuff and that statistics stuff, and also having the Six Sigma part to build on, ultimately growing into that leadership role where I was recognizing that I had this leadership structure, having these stakeholders that I was helping to support, helping the organization to build a global network of practitioners that I was helping to support with training and with document reviews, helping the knowledge set build on a global basis, and then ultimately spinning out into a consultancy to help other companies to also build their knowledge and their documentation to help them with their compliance efforts. So that's kind of been my career catalyst in a nutshell. And I'm looking forward to hearing whatever questions you guys might have about the career part or even the technical part about validation itself. I know that as a topic can be something that might be new to some people because, I forgot the The fun fact that I actually earned my degree before validation was a requirement for medical device. So technically, when I got my degree, validation wasn't even an option because it wasn't required yet for medical device. So who knows, with AI and everything, you might be getting a degree in something, and a few years from now, there'll be a whole new career that you could go into like I did.